This series of classes is called Coffee Is, where basically we are trying to discuss, what is coffee? That's the first question we kind of ask in the first class. This class is part two of the series. And coffee is a lot of things to a lot of different people, and it's a lot of different things at different points in the supply chain, right? So you can think of this six-part series as a very long seed to cup that hopefully goes a little more in depth than your kind of traditional seed to cup class, right? Um, and each class just kind of investigating different steps of the supply chain. These are meant to be kind of beginner level classes. So if you've been in coffee, a lot of this might be familiar to you. Um, if you're newer to coffee, hopefully it gives you a little more context for all the thing coffee kind of goes through to become that final cup. And yeah, if you are experienced in coffee, hopefully there's a new bit of information or a new way to think about something in here. I've been in coffee for 14 years here, and even in doing research for these classes and talking to people who are experts in different fields, I've learned a lot. There's always something new to learn about coffee, and equip us to be better prepared to serve coffee, to discuss how really just incredible coffee is, right? So um, today is part two in the series. This one is called Coffee is Agriculture. Today we are discussing all things coffee production, right? There's a lot of things we won't be able to touch on because there's so much complexity and variability in coffee production depending on where you are in the world, right? You know, uh, different decisions being made based on, economics, history, tradition, culture, varieties, the environment. So there's a lot of things obviously we're not going to be able to discuss here, but the goal here is to basically kind of look at like what are some of the most common practices amongst producers across the world, right? What are kind of the essential needs of the coffee plant? So class one is all about the plant and the plant's biology. Class two is now kind of that human intervention aspect. Um, and so the first question here is what is agriculture? Um, this is not as big or what's what I'm thinking of. Not as big of a question as what is coffee, right? I think we're all fairly familiar with the concept of agriculture, but if you look at just simple definition of what agriculture is in Webster, it is the science, art, or practice of cultivating soil, producing crops, and raising livestock in varying degrees, and the preparation and marketing of the resulting products, right? So think of agriculture as farming, um, both plants and livestock, right? But I really like this definition because it points out a lot of different things agriculture is. It is a science, it is a practice, a business, and an art form. And I think this absolutely applies to coffee, right? Especially when we think about specialty coffee. There's a ton of science involved. There's managing an entire ecosystem, the soil. Um, it is a practice. A practice to me kind of speaks to um, kind of, I don't know, just the presence required to cultivate coffee, right? An awareness, an understanding, and intuition of the land and the plants and how to kind of help those be in harmony in order to maximize production. Especially coffee is a small business, right? There is that marketing and preparation and the selling of the product. We won't talk as much to this aspect of coffee production today. This will be the fourth class where we kind of talk about the markets and commercialization of coffee. We're going to mostly focus on the act of farming or agriculture in this class. And it's an art form, right? There's so many things in this class today that we're not going to be able to put a number to or a step-by-step process to, right? There's a lot of intuition and experience that we really can't quantify. Um, but I appreciate the mention of it being an art form in a basic definition, for sure. And then there was, the marketing of the resulting products, the preparation and marketing. I kind of think of that as processing the preparation of the product, right? Turning this living seed into a raw product that is exportable. We won't talk about processing in this class. That will be the class following this. So this is class 2, all about farming. Class 3 is processing. Class 4 is commercialization. So class 3 is nearly done. Class 4 is also underway. We'll be putting those out really soon. So keep up with us if you're interested in those classes. Um, then if we kind of zoom out big picture of agriculture, we think of the start of agriculture being kind of the start of civilization as we know it, right? Humans start to settle down, they start to trade. It allows the formation of civilizations, of surplus. And so the history of agriculture, as crazy as that sounds, is really interesting. And like coffee, there have kind of been three waves of agriculture, starting 12,000 BCE, where Native Americans and Aboriginal Australian peoples kind of perfected controlled burning, clearing land for edible plants, um, tools, storage starts to evolve. And this kicks off that kind of first wave of agriculture, right? Where new methods, new systems, new tools are being created and shared around the world, enabling the explosion of agriculture. The second wave, 1500s, the British Agricultural Revolution. This is when plants start to be traded and moved around the world, and people's diets begin to expand rapidly, right? This is the time period in which coffee starts to move around the world. And then the third wave of agriculture hits around the 1950s. And basically, this is the time period in which scientists discover, in late 1800s that nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are essential for plant growth. Fertilizers start to be developed. The Green Revolution is when genetically modified foods are developed. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides, advanced irrigation techniques. All of this could produce really high yields. The 1950s kind of marks an era in which big business really starts to take over agriculture, and it's heavily about production, right? And so I think the interesting takeaway from the history of agriculture is that polyculturism, um, leading up to the late 1800s, is the most practiced farming method. Polyculturism is, planting multiple crops on one area of land. But come the late 1800s, with the boom of herbicides, pesticides, and fertilizers, monoculture kind of took over as the most dominant way of farming, where you plant one thing on one plot of land, right? That requires a lot more input into the land because it drains the nutrients. Polyculture methods kind of help revitalize the land naturally because you have a lot of different plants in the land, a lot more diversity, right? And so this is a larger narrative about the world's kind of practices and economies. But as climate change has become more threatening to more plants, polyculturism is starting to regain popularity in a lot of different industries. And I think that's something that's going to come back up for us later. We're going to kind of skip through all this. We mentioned coffee really starts to kind of expand in 1690 when it makes its way to Indonesia, the Bourbon Islands, Amsterdam, and then French travelers initially bring coffee to South America in 1723. Between the 1720s and 1820s, coffee is being produced already everywhere it pretty much grows today, right? Once in the hand of colonizers and consumers, coffee production expands rapidly as people really want coffee, right? And so, again, we're not going to be able to touch on all the differences amongst all those places on that map, right? We're going to talk about what are similar amongst those places on that map. So let's look at today some statistics regarding coffee production. We'll go quickly through that. Then we're going to get into some fundamentals of ecosystems and soil sciences. Then we're going to dive into the stages of coffee plants' growth and the corresponding stages of production. Then we'll look at essential yearly tasks, And then we'll round out the class with looking at different farming systems to kind of talk about different decisions producers make, and then environmental pressures on coffee production. This is a really big class. This class could be easily 4 hours long. Um, uh, I'm going to try and keep it under 2 hours here. I know that's a long time for a virtual class, so I appreciate y'all hanging with me. If you need to go at any time or if you have questions at any time, please feel free to ask those questions. And if you do need to go, you will get a recording if you can't make it all the way through the end. But we're going to try and get pretty quickly to the steps of production and the tasks of production here. So let's look at some statistics though, because obviously the world consumes a ton of coffee, right? That map we just looked at ended around the 1850s. In that time period, you can see 400,000 pounds of coffee is being produced. By the 1960s, we're up over 2 million. Um, I love history. Personally, I think history is really fascinating. We won't talk about, this entire timeline. Um, but you can see there was a surplus of coffee being produced from the 1920s on. During the Great Depression, demand dropped. So coffee production was increasing, but not as much coffee was being traded. Then adverse weather in Brazil um, made prices rise to an all-time high in 1953. Planting was increasing because the pricing was high, but this overproduction caused the coffee market to crash. And this all led to the creation of the quota system by the ICO in 1963 to kind of help stabilize prices, right? From 1961, we are growing from over 4 million to today being 10.5 million tons of coffee being exported, right? Um, you can see coffee really explodes in the 90s. This kind of marks a time period of emerging markets, right? Europe begins drinking a lot more coffee, Asia producing countries. So when I look at this massive amount of coffee being exported, it's hard to kind of, put in mind how much this is. A metric ton is over 2,000 pounds, right? It's hard to comprehend how much coffee this is. My question is, how much of that coffee is specialty, and how much of that coffee is produced by smallholders, right? Smallholder producers. So if you just Google that, you'll get a lot of different numbers. These stats I'm using in Veritas's numbers. It's a company that kind of uses on the ground surveys in 27 countries, geospatial technology to kind of gather their statistics. And by these metrics, 60% of coffee produced is produced on farms that are less than 5 hectares or 12 acres. That's what they qualify as a smallholder. The other 40% is grown on farms over that size, right? Around 20 on estates less than 50 hectares and 20% on estates over 50 hectares, right? So 60% of, the 10.5 million tons grown by smallholders producers. So how many producers is that? It's really impossible to put a number to, right? They estimate there are at least 12.5 million farms. The difficulty is determining, do you count maybe youth who might work on the farm, right? Children of producers. Do you count both husband and wife? How do you know if both work on the farm? Seasonal labor, but 12.5 million farms producing 60% of the world's coffee, right? And so you can kind of see where this is concentrated. East Africa, Indonesia, this is where most of the world's smallholder farms are concentrated. Um, Almost half in Ethiopia, Uganda, and Indonesia. The other near half is Vietnam, Burundi, Kenya, and Colombia. Um, and so when we talk about smallhold farmers, we think it's important to recognize the realities of being a coffee producer. And for me, this sets the stage for the important questions of coffee, right? Questions we are all discussing, but also recognizing how much work and attention goes into producing coffee and what currently kind of the return on that investment is, right? It's estimated that 44% of smallholders live below the international poverty line. 22% live in extreme poverty. Um, 63% of those producers are concentrated in East Africa. And according to the ICO, 5 million of these 12 and a half smallholders are women who contribute to 70% of coffee production's labor. So on the grand scale, around a third of smallholders earn less than $100 per year from coffee production, which is probably easily under the cost of actual production, right? So coffee is an industry sustained mainly by small private landholders, many of which are women. Little profit is made for most coffee producers. And so um, when we talk about specialty coffee and trying to pay more for coffee, to one, give producers a profit to input into their land the next year and continue to grow beautiful coffees. It's important to recognize these numbers and factors. The coffee market in and of itself, um, just this like last year was worth 452 billion, with 30 billion dollars making up the specialty coffee market. And I think this is really interesting because coffee or specialty coffee made up about 5% of the market revenue. And this is revenue from roasted coffee. But specialty coffee's growth rate is estimated to near 12% of the market share by 2032, right? You can see it's estimated by 2028, specialty coffee will make up almost 10% of the world's market share. So specialty coffee is growing, right? More coffee is being sold at a specialty rate, which we'll talk about in class 4. But to kind of round it all together, there was this quote recently from an article in Coffee Intelligence that kind of highlights this disparity between producers and other actors in the supply chain, right? Farmers' incomes are ultimately decided by a subjective matter of taste, yet coffee producing countries only receive about 10% of revenues generated in the retail market. So we're not going to answer these big questions about the industry in today's class, but I think it's important to set up the idea of, what is the guiding principle of specialty coffee? What is the answer to increasing the livelihood of producers, and how is that reflected in our business practices? And how do we value coffee production? Right. Again, we're not answering these questions today, but it's important that we continually ask them of ourselves in our businesses. So kind of setting the stage for agriculture, big picture, what it is, its history, what that looks like today. Let's now dive in to coffee production, right? So there's so many factors we have to consider in coffee production. And we're going to really key in on the ecological factors, right? The environment, the soil, the plant's stages of growth, what the producer is doing at each of those stages of growth, and the tasks per year, leading to cherry production and harvesting. So we're going to look at everything from planting a new seed up to harvesting, right? We're not going to go farther beyond that. So let's get into coffee farming. So when we think about the ecosystem, obviously the ecosystem is important, right? We know that ecosystems need to be in balance. They need to be healthy. And the ecosystem is made up of living producers, organisms which produce, that convert abiotic factors into food, or convert non-living things into food. So this is plants, algae. Consumers, we think of animals who maybe consume other producers to obtain food, and then decomposers, microorganisms that break down organic matter from dead plants and animals into components necessary for life, like carbon and nitrogen, right? So we've got living factors, and then we have non-living factors that all affect the ecosystem. Basic ones shown here: the temperature, amount of sunlight, the nutrients in the soil, the water, wind, oxygen, minerals, pH, humidity. All of these things affect basically what consumers and producers can thrive in an environment. Soil which is deeply important for coffee, obviously, contains both living and non-living things. For me, I'm not super familiar with soil science, so I wanted to learn a little bit more about what coffee needs to survive from the soil, right? It obviously needs a balanced ecosystem, but all of that is integral and related to the soil, right? So soil, that uppermost layer of the earth, it contains tons of minerals, water, gases, organic matter, and organisms um, that are constantly experiencing um, a degree of physical, biological, and chemical reactions to support the life of plants and soil organisms. Soil is a limited natural resource. It forms at really, really slow rates, about an inch per 500 years, averaged across the world. So let's talk about what soil has and what's necessary for coffee. So soil has different minerals of different sizes. Those sizes are broken down into sand, silt, and clay. Sand being the biggest. Sand has is allows for very good water drainage. Um, Silt is the medium size. Silt is really good at holding water, and then clay are the smallest particles. Again, good for holding water, but clay particles have charged surfaces that kind of attract and hold nutrients. Coffee needs a balanced amount of all three. Different plants, based on where they're indigenous to, thrive in different kinds of soil. Clay loam here in the center means equal parts all three. Coffee leans towards balanced loam towards sandy loam. So coffee needs good water drainage, good water holding, and lots of nutrients, right? Coffee needs water. Soil is 25 where there isn't water, there are gases. Gases are necessary for plants to be able to go through respiration. Gas, nitrogen, um, and uses building life to for the cells to continue to grow and thrive, right? Um, Next, we've got organic matter. Very, very important. Organic matter is basically the stuff from above the soil that contributes to the gases. So dead or alive plants and animals are dropping organic matter constantly. No problem, Maria Teresa. Thanks for being here. You'll get a recording. Um, plants, animals drop things to the soil that can turn into these gases. The thing that turns organic matter into gases are microorganisms. They decompose that organic matter and unlock or fix the gases that are within there. Um, so for coffee, in terms of the minerals that coffee needs, again, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. These are the big ones. These are basically the ones that coffee needs the most of per year. You can see when we don't have these things, bad things happen, right? It can slow the growth down, can cause chlorosis. The roots might not produce all the root hairs that it needs. The plant will yellow, it will hurt production, right? And then there's micronutrients. These are the micronutrients, meaning we don't need as much of these, but they are still necessary. Um, Coffee also needs small amounts of these things in the soil. So there's lots of nutrients that have to be in balance. Often when a plant is unhealthy, coffee plant is unhealthy, it's because there's something off in the soil. That's usually the first thing a producer will look at to diagnose and make sure, is there anything going on here with the soil that needs to be fixed? So there's macro and micronutrients, but then there's the pH of the soil, the pH meaning the acidity or the alkalinity of that soil, right? The pH of soil is determined by a lot of things, but it's predominantly set by the soil's parent material. So, what did that soil form from? What is the kind of rock or base layer that that soil is formed from? And then also the weathering process. How much rain does this area receive? More rainier and rainier places tend to acidify the soil. And if the soil becomes too acidic, which you can measure with this pH tester here, if the soil becomes too acidic, it's almost impossible for the plant to uptake those nutrients that are within the soil, right? So the acidity to alkalinity determines the solubility of nutrients for plants, how easy it is for that plant to absorb those nutrients. Um, if the soil is too acidic, it makes it really hard to get these macronutrients. If the soil is too alkaline, it makes it really hard to get these macro and micronutrients. Different plants have different ideal absorption ranges that they like, right? Different kinds of soil that they adjust more easily to. Um, Coffee, because it's indigenous to rainy areas, prefers slightly more acidic soil. Um, Soil again tends to acidify throughout the rainy season. So if the soil becomes too acidic, it becomes difficult to get coffee's nutrients, but that can be fixed, right? So pH is often regulated. And then there are different kinds of inputs you can put in the soil to decrease the pH or increase the pH. So the reason I'm putting this here at the top is that managing the soil and managing the entire ecosystem is necessary for coffee to thrive, right? We can't just plant coffee anywhere. Coffee is planted in very particular areas. Oh no, Andrew Sharp, I can't see the slides. Is that just mine? Can everybody else see the slides? You can see them. Let's see. Andrew, maybe try leaving and coming back really fast. I don't know why that would happen, but maybe when I click to the next slide, it'll reappear. Because I'm not sure if I can fix that for you. Um, so, uh, right, this is the base layer of coffee's health. There we go. Um, if the pH is off, or if even one of those macro or micronutrients, let's see, we're getting Andrew back in here. All right, Andrew, hopefully that works for you. So if the pH is off, or if one of those macro or micronutrients is deficient in the soil, that basically puts a ceiling on what that plant can absorb into its system, right? Soil balance is extremely, extremely important for coffees to be able to thrive. This is called Liebig's Law of Minimum. That kind of says, like, you know, it's not the total amount of stuff. No problem, Andrew Grove, that worked. It's not the total amount of stuff in the soil that kind of puts the ceiling on what a plant can absorb, but it's the scarcest resource that puts a ceiling on what a plant can absorb. So soil balance extremely important for coffee. And it's going to look different anywhere in the world, right? The other really important thing for coffee is microorganisms, right? The tiny, tiny organisms that turn organic matter into usable gases and resources for plants, right? So the first thing necessary for microorganisms is a carbon source, and that's what we get from organic material. They are able to turn that carbon into nitrogen, oxygen, and those kinds of things. There's up to 10 billion just bacterial cells alone per teaspoon or per gram of soil. Um, and the most bacteria lives around the roots of a plant. So, again, organic material is composed of living, dead, or very dead stuff from the environment, right? Whether that's leaves that have fallen, um, animal poop, animals that have died, um, other plants dying around them, all of that stuff is organic material, and microbes decompose those things, right? They consume them and turn them into something else. It's estimated that if you had soil, every 1% of organic material contains about 1,000 pounds of nitrogen, 100 pounds of phosphorus, 100 pounds of potassium, and so on. So it's essential to break down organic material to get those things we want in the soil. So microorganisms are necessary to get that stuff out. If you don't have a good micro community that can cause an imbalance of the pH in the soil. It can cause the die-off of roots, and it can allow for nutrients to run away, right? So microorganisms are really important, and something you are seeing more and more and more in coffee production is kind of encourage microbial activity. So big methods for encouraging microbial activity, composting and culturing. This is basically the practice of taking soil and culturing it, right? Fermenting it so that these microorganisms can multiply. Then you can apply that liquid like a fertilizer to the plants. So composting and culturing is becoming a very common practice. It's a great way of eliminating chemical pesticides, which are very expensive and can be harmful to the environment, and rather just kind of replenishing what is already existing on your farm. This is from a farm in Colombia where I went in preparation for this class, and they said the producer there said everything my plants need exists on this plot of land already. It's about harnessing that, unlocking that, and encouraging that, right? And so this is one way he did that. He cultures his soil to grow more and more microorganisms to feed back to the soil. And then he mulches. He adds organic material to the soil so that those microorganisms can continue to thrive. Intercropping, right? Having a bunch of plants on your land to kind of contribute to the health of the ecosystem is really important, and can increase microbial activity. Adding, like I said, organic material or mulch to the soil helps increase microbial activity, and then avoiding chemicals as much as possible. Chemicals can kill those microbes. So this is a quote. We won't read all through this, but this is a quote from a study in Hawaii that was done for coffee production. But um, culturing microbes goes back really, really long time. Farmers have been practicing this for thousands of years to kind of maintain a healthy ecosystem. And this is something we are seeing more and more in coffee. So, that being said, we're about to now get into the life cycle of the coffee plant and tasks of coffee production. Hopefully, I didn't take too long getting through that beginning phase, still dialing this class in. But let's take a quick break. I'm gonna get another cup of coffee, some water. Then we'll come back and talk about producing coffee, the actual tasks and materials needed to produce coffee. If you think of any questions at this point, put them in the chat. And we'll be back here in just 3 minutes. But let's take a quick break here. right, let's get into the rest of this class here. Coffee production. So we're going to kind of follow a couple trains of thought here. We're going to look at the life cycle of the plant and then the corresponding stages of production that go with those life cycles. So we're going to basically look at planting a seed up to the first harvest. Then coffee produces fruit every year from there on. So then we're going to look at the tasks that are done every year for the entire crop. Again, impossible to identify all the tasks a producer might undertake, right? There'd be tons of variance depending on the place. Producers make many decisions related to cultivation informed by things we won't discuss, right? Differences in varieties, the desired outcome in terms of quality, costs associated with the tasks, cultural and historically informed methodologies, the labor available. There's so many things we won't be able to speak to. So this is not like an absolute reflection of all coffee production, but hopefully a broad outline of what most specialty coffee producers are doing throughout a year. And this portion was largely made by the help of different producers and agronomists that we work with at Cafe Imports who contributed their thoughts and their timelines to this class. So I will call them out individually as we go through here. But here's our growth stages and our production stages. Germination, right? Planting a seed and it's germinating. Then the shoot and leaf development, right? Then we'll look through leaf and branch development, branch elongation, flowering, fruiting, and then senescence is kind of the phase in between the next harvest. So we will examine the nursery or developing a seedling, transplanting that plant out into the farm, cultivation, which is ongoing, obviously, and then we'll look at what's being done during flowering and ripening, and then harvest. After that first harvest, we then kind of repeat the cycle of flowering, fruiting, senescence, flowering, fruiting, senescence. Cultivation will be ongoing throughout, and we're going to kind of break down the cultivation tasks by season, right? You've got dry season, wet season, and this is the rest of dry season here. So around 4 months to 5 months of dry season, and around 7 months of wet season or 8 months, depending on the place you are at. So we're going to break everything down by wet and dry season. You'll see that in those colors and in these little symbols here. So again, lots of considerations here. The varieties, what varieties are available, the farm layout, strength and weaknesses of those varieties, decisions about spacing between plants, sun versus shade depends on varieties, the soil content, what the market is looking for, and what is stable in the market at this point. All of these things kind of go into the complexity of coffee production, right? So let's just start out first with obtaining seeds. That's kind of step one, right? So nurseries is obviously the area where plants are grown for transplanting. In coffee, raised beds and shade cover is pretty standard. Not all producers have nurseries, right? They might plant the seedling straight into the farm and tend it there. This process, seedlings will spend around 9 months in a nursery before being transplanted. You can see these seedlings are planted in the middle of wet season and cultivated through the rest of wet season into dry season, and then be transplanted at the beginning of the following wet season. The growth phases, the plant germinates, and then it will develop around 9 or more leaf and branch sets before being transplanted. So let's talk about the steps here. Step one, obtain seeds. Seeds are obtained from maybe local nurseries, saved from the field, maybe received from friends or neighbors, purchased from in-country organizations or world organizations. The main thing here is it's important to know that the seeds are healthy, to know where they come from, because it's a big investment, both time and money, into developing an entirely new set of plants, right? The seeds are then tested for moisture content. Seeds need to have at least 20% moisture content to germinate. So often the seeds will be soaked overnight and then they will be planted in a prepared raised bed. So the germination area um, is kind of a mixed soil of sand and peat that's been sifted and washed to kind of get rid of any microbial contamination. Um, the raised bed needs really good drainage and aeration so that the roots can grow really deep, unrestricted, straight down into the sand. So the seeds are placed in the sand, they're covered, the bed is watered nearly every day. And after about a week, the root shoot will form out of the seed. So that very initial bit of root shoots out of the seed. And then as that stem grows, it pushes the seedling upward on its stem out of the soil. And around 2 weeks old is when that seedling emerges. A week later, continuing to water the plant, um, the very first two leaves, called the cotyledons, will unfold and kind of burst forth from that seed. Um, the stem is continuing to elongate, and by 2 months old, so 2 months into the entire process, you get the first set of true leaf pairs. At this point, all of the energy, all of the nutrients held within the seed have been expended at this point in germination. So from here on out, the seedlings will require more nutrient-rich soil to sustain growth. And this is when you see the seedlings um, transplanted into these individual bags or tubettes. Um, and step one of that is choosing the best seedlings. So you will pull the seedling out of that raised bed and examine the root system. Roots can have all sorts of things go wrong. They can maybe fork into two main root systems, which is bad. They might not develop fully straight down and very long. They might be short off to the side. They might not have root hairs on them. So you are picking the best roots, which mean they're growing really straight. They have lots of root hairs, and those are what are being transplanted. After that, the plants are cultivated for another 6 months. The soil in these bags or in these tubettes is typically soil from the farm mixed with some organic material or maybe coffee parchment. They still need good drainage, so you want some larger pieces in there. But now you actually kind of want to condition this plant to the soil they're going to be planted into. Um, and yeah, another 6 months of cultivation here. And you're going to see the roots deepen, the stem grow, more leaf pairs develop, and then branches will start to develop. When the coffee is a very, very young seedling, it's pretty much kept in shade constantly, avoiding any harsh sunlight. As the plant matures and gets older and older, you'll start to use less and less shade. Other things that need to be done during this time period, getting rid of any weeds that might appear, watching out for microbial contamination or diseases, constantly watering, and then keeping tools sanitized that you're using. Microbial contamination can be a really big concern in a nursery. So at 9 months old, the plant will bear about 9 leaf pairs at least, and the plant is approaching maturity to be transplanted. So in the nursery, watering, disinfecting, managing shade, managing pests. These are all constant tasks that a producer is watching out for. But once that plant hits 9 months old, now it's time to transplant. And you can see transplanting happens right at the beginning of wet season. You want to transplant that plant in a healthy soil where it's receiving rain and water. This is a period of high growth, right? The plant is really kind of beginning to explode in size, in height, and the amount of leaves that it has. So this happens right at the beginning of wet season. It might take a month, it might take a few months depending on a producer's steps. So step one, clearing the ground of weeds. You don't want the plant being planted in an area of a lot of competition, right? So a predetermined lot is cleared of weeds by hand, machine, or whatever method, controlled burning. Um, Different farms have different methods for handling shade. You can see this farm has removed a lot of the shade cover, and then they will go back and plant trees intentionally to shade the plant. Um, Maybe the natural forest is where these plants will be planted. Lots of different methods in terms of managing shade, which we'll talk about later. Step two is digging a hole for that plant. Step three, um, adding fertilizer or organic material or microorganisms to that area, kind of treating the area, giving it lots of nutrients for that new plant. It's recommended that this treatment rests for at least a week to even a month for the soil to absorb it and incorporate it. Then step four, planting the seedlings, right? And then an optional step five is to add mulch cover to kind of lock in all the nutrients and the moisture for that plant. So you can see these were planted in rows here, and then you've got some new shade trees planted here for these ones at this farm in particular. And then step six is fertilizing or treating that soil again around a month later. So you can see where that hole was on this row of coffee trees. Typically, when a farm is being replanted, no more than like 25% of a farm is being replanted at once, right? Once some trees kind of age out, they're getting too old to be super productive, that those are what are being replaced. So it requires a lot of careful planning of the farm, right? You imagine an entire farm, different plants at different ages. You want to strategically plan kind of when you're turning over areas of your farm. Um, so lots of planning and lots of time goes into replanting an area, depending on how many plants you are putting in, right? Could be 1,000, could be way more than that. Um, and then from there on, you are cultivating this plant for at least 2 or 3 years before that plant is mature enough to bear its first harvest. And then often the first harvest is really small. The first harvest is not super high production of a coffee plant, but the second and third harvest, you get a lot more production and a lot more quality out of it. So again, really big time investment before you are ever getting something back from this portion of your farm, right? Um, so for the next 2 to 3 years, the plant is maturing into being a fruit-bearing plant, right? So we're going to come back to these tasks, pruning, maintenance. We talked about replanting, fertilizing, weeding, pest control, and then ultimately harvest there at the end. But these are the tasks we're talking about when we're taking a plant from a really young, newly planted to still a young but now fruit-producing full tree. So we'll run back on those tasks after we get through this phases. So 4 years old, the plant is now mature enough to bear its first fruit. Step one to bearing fruit is flowering. The process of flowering can take 3 to 4 weeks from the time the inflorescence emerges. The inflorescence is the kind of cluster of buds. Um, they will appear, and then flowering will occur over 3 to 4 days. So it's about a month for all of a farm's plants to go through this full process. Um, if you've ever been on a coffee farm during flowering, it's beautiful. They're like really small, white 5 petal flowers. They really smell pretty amazing. But let's talk about what the plant needs to flower. Coffee is a very seasonal plant, meaning it relies on rainy seasons and dry seasons. During the dry season, this causes some hydric stress on the plant, or what you could call water or drought stress. And it's believed now that hydric stress, the dry season, can help trigger the flowering in coffee. It's kind of an adaptive mechanism. It's basically a response to the plant is under stress. It needs to ensure seed production. And so when the plant survival is threatened, it kind of tells the system, all right, it's time to trigger flowering and fruit production. Studies have shown that some hydric stress can cause more flowers and increase the amount of carbohydrates accumulating in the flowers, and ultimately increasing more fruit. Um, so step one, hydric stress. Step two, hydric stress encourages flowers to appear. And then step three, the rainy season kind of hits right at that time. So you can see in this chart, dry season into wet season is when flowering occurs. The rains coming kind of helps trigger the blooming or the flowering. Obviously, too much hydric stress is harmful to the plant, but the dry season kind of triggers flowering. So then rain triggers blooming or flowering. Flowering occurs for 3 to 4 days, and this is the pollination period. In the previous class, we talked about Arabica and Robusta a lot, and how Arabica is the only self-pollinating plant, but Arabica can be cross-pollinated as well, right? So self-pollination occurs basically when pollen um, from one stigma transfers to another and goes to the ovule and fertilizes the plant. But then there's cross pollination, where pollen is transferred through insect intervention, right? Like we think about. Only 10 to 15% of flowering plants self pollinate across the world. And Arabica is the only coffee species to self pollinate. Um, but cross-pollination is shown to also increase fruit. Um, Coffee flowers are very fragrant. They're attractive to pollinators. And so cross-pollination is really, really good for coffee. Um, so 3 to 4 day pollination period, and then the flower will dry, fall away, leaving behind the carpel that contains the ovary that develops into a fruit. So this is a picture from Colombia. I really like this picture because, um, oh, it's saying poor network quality. Hopefully I'm not chopping out, because it shows um, flowering that's about to occur, flowers that fell away, and then fruit that is ripening. So in Colombia, there's multiple rainy seasons. There's usually 2 harvests per year. So you're actually seeing 3 phases on this plant. You're seeing 2 rainy seasons ago, it's fruit nearing mature. The last rainy season, fruit about to develop, and then a current rainy season's flowers. So after those flowers fall away, um, and the plant is fertilized, now fruit begins to develop where those flowers were. The ripening stage takes about 8 months. So again, flower occurs right at the beginning of wet season, and then ripening goes throughout the rest of wet season and into the dry season. Um, so let's talk about fruit development. Fruit development is really interesting. It's an extremely complex biochemical process. I'm not the best at talking about it, and it's still constantly being studied. We are still learning more and more and more about the systems required to produce and then ripen fruit. But we're going to talk about the basic kind of steps that coffee goes through in relation to flavor precursors, right? Things that are developing within the fruit that we find really delicious, right? So there's a few different steps in fruiting. Step one, after flowering, there is a massive release of nutrients and hormones throughout the plant that travel to the branches, to the ovaries, to develop the first layer, which is perisperm. Perisperm develops around the ovary. We know perisperm as the silver skin. The very, very thin layer that is around the seed is a pretty thick layer in the beginning. It is a nutritive layer. It's all those nutrients and hormones kind of form that perisperm around the embryo and feed that embryo. And then that embryo begins developing the actual seed, fruit, and fruit skin layers around that. So after the perisperm develops, the first big step of the seed developing is cell division and then cell expansion. So um, the seed starts to develop. through cell creation. They are rapidly dividing and expanding, developing the seed. And then those cells expand in size. The cells of the seed are what hold all the nutrients within it. So these cells develop and expand and then begin holding nutrients. And this is while the cherry is still green. Most of the size of the seed is developed during this time period. So when you have that green skin, that is when the seed is kind of growing in size. Um, Throughout this phase of the seed growth, the perisperm is kind of being consumed and all the nutrients within the perisperm. Um, Once that seed is fully developed inside in size, starches and ethylene start to accumulate in the seed. So new things are delivered to the seed. Starch is necessary for an embryo to survive. Ethylene is important for triggering ripening. Ethylene is necessary in all fruits to ripen. Um, when you think of like bananas, they're constantly kind of producing ethylene and ripening on our counters. If you put more fruit next to bananas, they ripen even faster. Um, Putting fruits in the fridge will slow down ethylene and will slow down ripening. So ethylene is necessary for the fruit to change its color, to soften, to build up carbohydrates, to encourage more sugar and organic acids to form. So that is taking the plant from green to red. The colors will change. Starches that we're accumulating break down into sugars. Acids are kind of starting to compose, and then lots of aromatic compounds will increase as the fruit approaches ripeness. So this kind of back half going from green to red is where sugars, acids, and volatile aromatics are kind of being finalized within the fruit. The ethylene amount influences the development of all of these things. Again, all this is really complex. I'm not super smart in it, but um, seed forms, then starch and ethylene are delivered to the seed. That basically triggers the formation of sugars, acids, and aromatic compounds. And now, once that cherry has reached full ripeness, dark red, it is time for harvest. During this ripening phase, this 8 months, fertilization is needed. The plant is using a lot of nutrients during this time. You want to control weeds, you want to control pests, and then it's shown that cooler weather slows down maturation, which increases the size and the amount of sugars, acids, oils, and aromatics within the fruit. So coffee tends to grow at higher elevations. We talk about elevation because you know, during the day it's warm, but in higher elevations at night it's much cooler. That helps slow the maturation down, and that helps increase the amount of stuff within the fruit. So cooler weather increases the amount of stuff we want. So that dry matter is that stuff we want, right? Everything that's not water within the fruit. So the sugars, the acids, the fats, the oils, the esters. You can see that not a lot of stuff is being developed in these very beginning phases during the cell division. Once cells begin to expand, this is where the seed starts to take in a lot of nutrients. And then that ethylene, this third stage, that is where you get a lot of your dry matter set. Post maturation, all that stuff breaks down. We'll come back to that here in just a minute. So that's fruit development. And again, it's about continually keeping the plant supplied with the nutrients it needs to continue ripening. Um, then there's harvest. Depending on a producer's practices, harvest could take 1 month, it could take 5 months, right? Really depends on the location and the season and a farmer's methodology. Um, Harvest takes up most of the dry season. This is the busiest season on a coffee farm. Harvest takes a lot of time and a lot of intentionality, right? And then this is also the time when the plant goes into senescence. So on that last chart, you saw the dry matter increases, but then once that seed or once that fruit hits mature, the amount of dry material drops off as that plant begins to essentially, or as that fruit begins to ferment and over ripen. And also, the plant basically diverts its energy away from the fruit towards the rest of the plant, towards developing more branches and more leaves. So, senescence is a period in which basically the plant will basically kill its own fruit and send that energy elsewhere preparing for the next season, right? This is the time period in which we are picking off the fruit when it's at its ripest. And yeah, it's difficult to really kind of describe the amount of labor, intentionality, and timeliness required to achieve a great harvest. But this is where a ton of work comes in. So there's a lot of different ways to harvest. We're going to talk about three main methods. Mechanical harvesters, we see this a lot with commodity coffee, right? Super high volume coffee, particularly Brazil. You have these rods on a column just spinning and smacking off the coffee, kind of shaking it off the tree. That fruit is caught on a conveyor belt and then is put into um, a really big container. That's mechanical harvesting. Strip harvesting is similar, except it's by hand, where basically um, you can see they're reaching into the base of the branch and pulling outward to strip all of the fruit off the coffee plant. This is common on commodity farms or at the very end of a harvest, basically going back through all the trees after you've selectively harvested and then pulling off anything remaining, usually the less healthy fruit. And then the method we are probably most familiar with, selective harvesting, where you are harvesting cherries based on their coloration, right? You're trying to collect cherries when they hit their peak ripeness. And this is the method that takes a lot of time, right? Cherries are developing at different rates. And so there's usually a system of going through and harvesting every so often. But intentional hand picking is selective harvesting. So you can see this is pretty early in the harvest. This gentleman is going through looking for just the ripest coffee and just picking those ripe ones off. So like I said, it's really early in harvest. Most of the tree is being skipped over, right? A lot of those cherries are underripe. They're going to let those stay on and allow them to ripen. And that's really kind of the name of the game, going through, getting the ripest. You will also pick off anything overripe or damaged because you don't want it taking up energy from the plant. And then you will leave anything underripe on the plant, right? Selective picking is done tree by tree, row by row, day by day throughout the entire harvest season. So, how do you know what to harvest? Like I said, it's all about color. You can see like this one here is a perfect kind of purple from the base to the very top versus like, you know, these ones down here are just maybe a day or two less ripe than that one. They are a little brighter red to purple from the bottom to the top. This one here is another good example of being bright to dark. And so when harvesting, if you're being super selective, like I would probably include this one and this one. These are all like beautifully ripe, right? These really dark ones and these lighter ones would be considered underripe. This one's ripped, so that one's going to over ferment very quickly. And then these other ones left over are kind of like judgment calls, right? It depends what you're going for with a lot. If you're trying to make the nicest lot possible, you might be super selective about what ripeness levels are let through versus a slightly larger volume lot. So it all depends on the end goal of that particular offering, right? A lot of farms have Brix meters where they can measure kind of the dry content within the fruit. You kind of squeeze the fruit onto this meter, the juice, then you can kind of count the sugar content within that cherry, and that can help you decide, all right, it's time to harvest. Here's an example of a harvest schedule for selective harvesting. During a month, you might harvest for an entire week Then you might wait 2 weeks for the rest of it to kind of catch up. Harvest, stop harvesting, harvest, stop harvesting. This is a really common method for a harvest season where you're kind of getting everything and then waiting for things to mature, getting everything, waiting for the rest to mature. So again, it's like multiple sweeps of the entire farm throughout the harvest season. Um, this work, again, it's really detailed, really time consuming. It requires a lot of labor. Often smallholders are having to hire labor to capitalize on getting all the cherries possible, right? Um, but this kind of work is necessary for producing those really beautiful coffees, those micro lots, or regional lots we really enjoy, right? So, um, after harvest, this is when you get into processing, selling a harvest. This is also the farm's off season, right? You've basically got ripening for 8 months, harvest for 3+ months, and then you've got the following 8 months of coffee ripening again, right? Right after harvest, this is when you kind of already get back into flowering, right? Um, so this flowering and ripening is where a lot of off-season cultivation tasks are being done. And that's what we're going to talk about next, different cultivation tasks. Um, let's see here, 10:15. We might take one more break here. Let's take another few minutes, and then we're going to go through all these tasks and kind of get the class wrapped up. So, um, let's see here. Let's do another 3 minutes, and we'll finish out this back portion of the class. I appreciate y'all so much. Let me know if you have questions or thoughts about those steps. We'll talk about cultivation here in just a second. Right. Let's get this PowerPoint pulled back up and keep it going. Everybody, like I said, longer class. Appreciate y'all sticking with me here. Let's get into the tasks done every year for the entire farm, and then kind of close out talking about some of the pressures facing coffee production. Um, so the first thing we're going to look at here is a couple of calendars of tasks provided again by suppliers in different areas of the world. The biggest thing for me coming into this class was one, I don't really know what a producer does day to day in the farm to kind of maintain their crop. So there was the question of what are the essential tasks? And then two, is this different? Is this similar throughout the world, right? And so um, what I found was that tasks are pretty consistent. There is definitely kind of a system to maintaining coffee per season. So that kind of helps us come up with this calendar of kind of like this is the average of everybody I talk to of what the tasks are and when they are done. So like I said earlier, harvest is the busy season. There's really nothing going on there and not much going on there the month or two following, right? Come wet season, this is where a lot of tasks are being done leading up to harvest. So this is our anchor point. This is harvest, 3 to 5 months during the dry season. Then you've got pruning right after, farm maintenance at the beginning of what season, along with replanting and weeding right at the beginning of wet season, fertilization throughout, pest control throughout as well, another occurrence of weeding. So let's talk about these tasks, why the timing is important. Let's go through our calendars though. This is from Aguilar Brothers Micromill in Costa Rica. You can see flowering right at the beginning of wet season, ripening throughout wet into dry season, and then 3 months of harvesting, followed by pruning, followed by farm maintenance, fertilizing, replanting, weeding, and pest control. In Rwanda, there's not really a fly crop for tropic coffee, but there are two wet seasons. So a fly crop is when there are two wet seasons, and then that means you get two harvests per year. But you can see there's really only one big harvest in Rwanda. You get flowering, then you get ripening, and then harvest for 4 months, again, followed by pruning, replanting, fertilizing, weeding. Here's Java. Again, flowering at the beginning of wet season through to the next dry season, harvest, and again, a huge load of tasks right at the beginning of the following wet season. So that's the main pattern here, right? Is like harvest is really busy, pruning is always right after harvest, and then those other tasks throughout the wet season. So let's kind of talk about each of these tasks individually real quick. Um, pruning. Pruning is done right at the end of harvest, and in some cases during the end of harvest. There's two kinds of prunings. Maintenance pruning is done almost yearly, and then stumping is done every so often. So let's talk about the difference in these. But it's always done right after harvest. So pruning or maintenance pruning in particular is when you go with clean shears and you cut anything unproductive, damaged, or unhealthy from the plant, right? Um, again, this is done typically every year. Nearly every tree, anything that's damaged will be removed because if it's damaged, you don't want the tree expending energy on something that's already kind of unproductive, right? The goal is to do this during dry season, when it's still dry season, because just like if we have a wound and it's exposed to moisture, that can cause infection, right? So you want to be able to prune during dry season and let it mostly heal up before wet season comes. Trees are pruned every year to every other year, at least. Pruning helps increase new growth. So often when you cut something damaged away, you might get new growth there. It decreases the risk of diseases transferring or nutrients being used on something damaged. And it's also done just to maintain size and shape, right? The other thing it helps with is prevent any aggressive biennial bearing. Biennial bearing is a phenomenon where fruiting plants kind of alternate big harvest, little harvest every year. So this is a chart from Brazil from 2014 to 23. Basically, there's a big trend shown here that one year is productive, the next year is less productive, right? Pruning helps kind of level that curve. Biennial bearing is common in coffee, it's common in apples, pears, and some other fruiting plants. So that's yearly pruning. Stumping is a lot more of an aggressive, every so often kind of pruning. Stumping is where you are basically cutting the coffee trunk below all the stems. So you're just stumping that tree, right? This is done to really old plants um, when they're kind of slowing down in production. By cutting it off at the bottom, you encourage really vigorous new growth. Um, so this is an example of a stumped plant. You can see it was stumped not high from the ground, and now you're getting two new main stems producing. This was stumped just a couple months before these new stems grew. So this is typically done, you get your first harvest at 4 years old for a plant. So then maybe 7 to 10 to 15 years later, that plant will start to slow down its production. You'll stump it, and then you'll get another few years of high production out of it. Um, this is typically done maybe to 15 to 20% of the farm per year, depending on the plant's age. So it kind of delays the need to replant older trees. So here's a video of a stumped plant. You can see it was an older plant. It's a pretty thick trunk. You're going to get really aggressive new growth. It might not produce a good yield that year, but the few years following, it will produce pretty high yields. So stumping done right after harvest. The next big task, right at the beginning of wet season, farm maintenance. When we're talking farm maintenance, there's a lot of different little tasks within this. That is shade management, right? So kind of managing the ecosystem, maybe planting more shade trees, moving some shade to new areas, um, or maintaining other crops that are amongst the coffee, facility or machinery upkeep, upgrades or repairs, and then creating or collecting compost or manure or getting fertilizer to last the following wet season, right? So kind of setting everything up for the following wet season. You are starting to get paid for your last crop. You need to invest in the things necessary for the future crop. Shade management is really, really important. It's a way to increase diversity and maybe even add economic value to a farm while creating shade and windbreaks to protect your coffee crops. Shade trees and other crops help control soil erosion, and it can increase pollinators and help with irrigation in the land. So shade management is a way to replenish the soil naturally, right? Again, kind of balancing that ecosystem. Fertilizing. Fertilizing is something done throughout the wet season. There's a lot of different methods depending on where you are, but basically during the rainy season, nutrients are often being washed away from the land. So shade control helps with this. Um, there's also, we talked about composting and culturing, manure, applying those things to your plants. Fertilizer is defined as any natural or synthetic material that is applied to the soil to supply nutrients. As far as chemical fertilizers go, there's soil applied. This is what you see here, some pellets being applied. And then there's foliar applied, a spray that you apply to the leaves. There's lots of different kinds of fertilizer. Um, right now, fertilizer is extremely expensive. Um, and so yeah, it's a big investment, but it's often necessary in different areas. Um, the big ones are NPK fertilizers. Those are your three big macronutrients, right? Nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium. And so this is an NPK 2020, right? There's different ratios of NPK fertilizers. There's also single. single nitrogen fertilizers. All of this depends on the farmer's land, right? The farmer becomes pretty intimate with what that land needs every single year. There's micronutrient fertilizers. Organic fertilizers fulfill the same needs as these, but they're often more expensive. And then amendments are basically things that might not provide a massive amount of nutrients, but they help control the pH, maybe increase the microorganism count, add structure to the soil. So these are things like biosolids, compost, peat moss, topsoil, sawdust, sand, limes. Those are all considered amendments. Fertilization is done periodically based on, noticeable changes in the plant health, basically. Um, Soil testing can be done to discover what soil nutrients might be lacking. Not all producers have access to soil testing, right? In which case, the producer's knowledge of their land will kind of guide their fertilization decisions. But it's been shown that compost and manure can effectively reduce chemical fertilizers, which can be, again, really expensive and harmful to the environment, right? Overusing chemical fertilizers can hurt the soil and the livelihood just of the entire area. Pest control. So, pest control, you can see there's wet and dry season pest control. Often there's different pests in different seasons that have to be watched out, that you have to watch out for. Um, and coffee faces a lot of pests and pathogens, insects, fungi, viruses, bacteria. This is not like an extensive list by any means. Um, but pests and pathogens can be treated with pesticides and fungicides. Conditions like really high humidity, nutrient deficiency, weeds, debris can increase your risk of outbreaks. There's lots of organic practices to help control pests. So deploying enemy bacteria, spore traps, organic formulations that can fight pests. Lime sulfur is shown to be effective. Shade management can help control pests. All of these things can be effective, like synthetic applications, but there aren't a ton of studies on like the best organic methods for controlling pests in coffee. Um, Typically, farmers will use chemical pesticides or fungicides as kind of a last resort. So pest control is not something that you're just applying to an entire field at a certain time per year. It's more of a response, right? Hopefully, your farm isn't invaded by pests or funguses, right? That's ideally what happens. But if there is an outbreak, a farm is kind of waiting to a considerable percentage of the farm is affected. And then it's about kind of, not allowing it to spread. So you're going to kind of spot treat and try and contain these pests to that affected area rather than applying it to the entire farm. Because one, these are expensive inputs, and two, they can be damaging for the land, right? And so uh, copper-based fungicides are effective against leaf rust. Fungicides are added to the soil. The plant incorporates this into its system and helps kind of fight funguses from within. And then there's soil applied or foliar spray applied things for pests. There's lots of different pests in different areas. But again, there are organic practices that can help fight these off naturally. So fertilizing and pesticide kind of done throughout wet season and a little bit into dry season. And then weeding. Weeding is really, really important, obviously. You want to remove any unwanted or invasive species within the coffee's area because it steals nutrients, it steals light, it steals water. And so, again, there's kind of wet and dry season weeds. There's usually a big weeding at the beginning of each season. So you can see this is a pretty freshly weeded, super clean farm that we're seeing here, right? Eliminating weeds at the beginning of a season helps slow their expansion, but weeding is kind of a constant task, right? So those are the cultivation tasks. It's kind of the schedule per year. Again, busy harvest season, lots of farm maintenance, pruning at the beginning of the following wet season, and then controlling weeds, pests, and the soil throughout the rest of the wet season as fruit is developing. So I think we're going to skip this break and just kind of get into the end of this class here. But hopefully that kind of breakdown of farming steps and tasks gives you more of a concrete idea of like what is going on year after year. What are all the costs, both in terms of time and money, to kind of maintain a farm, um, and where decisions are made about a farm. We're going to speak to this a little bit more um, as we get into farming systems. All right, last stretch here, folks. Appreciate you hanging out. Yeah, if you have any questions kind of throughout this end phase, we're going to kind of go kind of quickly through here. But I wanted to talk about shade versus sun grown, kind of again going back to decisions producers are making, and then also look at pressures that coffee production is facing. So farming systems. We hear about full sun, we hear about shade grown. Within that, there's like a whole spectrum of kind of systems from sun to shade. Um, a farming system is kind of a decision-making unit um, comprised by the farm household, cropping, and a livestock system. A kind of basically decisions to transform the land based on your desired outcome of your crop, right? So your method of farm management. Um, we're not looking at farming system basically to decide like this is the best way for coffee, but more to help us understand historical and socioeconomic factors that kind of persuade how a farm is managed, how important an ecosystem is, and how environmental pressures are kind of changing approaches to coffee production in terms of farming systems. So let's kind of make all that make sense. 5 farming systems. The most rustic farming system is basically if you planted coffee in a native forest and didn't manipulate the forest at all. Traditional polyculture, coffee planted in a forest, but then you're also incorporating numerous species for subsistence or markets. Commercial polyculture is where you're replacing a forest with intentional shade trees. Um, Shaded monoculture um, is using a single shade species to create a canopy. You're starting to require a lot more inputs, and then unshaded monoculture, no shade cover, lots of input, lots of labor to maintain this land because the soil is being depleted every year. So you can see it's a spectrum, but these 4 are all considered shaded systems, right? There's a lot of variance within shaded systems versus unshaded. So farmers are making decisions about manipulating the shade coverage, what other kinds of species want to be incorporated into that land. Is it just coffee, a monoculture, or is it a polyculture, right? So, benefits of shaded systems. This might be pretty obvious, but trees help provide soil erosion control. They contribute organic matter. It helps water retention. It reduces wind speed, which helps pollinators. It attracts more wildlife, which is more organic matter. Um, it increases land space for threatened species, and more shade coverage helps moderate the temperature and humidity of the land, right? Um, but obviously, the more stuff you have on the land, the less room for coffee, right? So there's decisions about handling what is endemic to an area versus what you are planting in that area. But overall, there are many benefits of having a shaded system. A big word we might hear is agroforestry. Agroforestry is the intentional integration of trees and shrubs into a crop, right? So again, there's a spectrum, but agroforestry is becoming a solution to the problems coffee faces. And another big thing being talked about is ecological services, right? By maintaining the natural ecosystems, what are the benefits that humans are getting from ecosystems? I'd argue it's priceless, but ecosystems that are kind of, when we let an ecosystem be exactly what it is and maintain a balanced ecosystem, it can provide food, water, viable fuel, can regulate air quality and soil and pollination, it can support species, and then there's cultural significance, right? Um, the art, engineering, cultural identity, recreation, all of these things are different services we are provided by ecosystems, right? And it's estimated that our ecosystems are worth $33 trillion a year. Um, the main point here is that agroforestry is a way of maintaining these ecological services while still benefiting commercially from the land, right? And deforestation is a problem, right? Deforestation is contributing to global warming. And so by being able to kind of put a number to our ecosystems, it helps us recognize like when we remove parts of a forest, we are losing a lot of stuff, a lot of services, right? And so the reason I bring this up is because in coffee at this point, coffee is becoming more and more difficult to grow. And there is a massive cultural importance to maintaining natural ecosystems in coffee farms. And so, trying to round this all together here kind of quickly, but there are around 820 indigenous cultures that participate in coffee production. These systems of farming are deeply rooted in cultural and historical methodologies. And many of these indigenous cultures that produce coffee also produce a ton of other things for either local markets, subsistence, global markets. For example, there's a big group of producers in Bolivia we work with. And in Bolivia, land preservation is like deeply rooted in their indigenous philosophy and their religious practices. And as a result, those practices have naturally qualified them for organic and bird-friendly certifications, right? It gives these producers a premium by practicing something they've practiced for a long, long, long time. Balancing the ecosystem is really, really important to that culture. And so there's been lots of studies done. There was a 2008 study I thought was interesting that showed non-coffee products at different market levels, accounting for almost a third of a farm's monetary value, a coffee farm's monetary value. There's also value in a group of people being socially and politically, self-sufficient by growing multiple things for subsistence and markets. It contributes to self-sufficiency and and indirectly promotes local self-governments, right? Rather than being reliant on a national system as heavily, right? There's a really interesting story from Mexico in a study that I'll link to at the end. If this stuff is interesting, I'd highly recommend reading a few different studies about this because it's a really, really interesting way of thinking how shade grown, how much value there is in shade grown coffee, right? And then there's recent studies about how agroforestry systems can decrease pests and pathogens naturally, right? Giving pests and pathogens other vegetation to kind of go to rather than just coffee helps coffee. And obviously, shaded systems help control soil runoff. It increases the amount of microbes in the soil. It sequesters necessary carbon dioxide, oxygen, and requires less fertilizer input, right? And so kind of like what we're coming to here is that in the face of global warming and ecological pressures, um, we're not trying to say that specific farming systems are better than another, but we're highlighting that biodiversity is kind of beneficial um, on many different levels, and that we talked about big business kind of took over agriculture in the 50s, right? And so that idea of maximize production at the cost of an ecosystem, um, we are now looking at obviously is not the best way to do things, right? Um, Indigenous people have practiced shade growing and polyculturism for a long, long, long time, but it's decreased with commercialization of coffee, right? So the world has transitioned from polyculture to monoculture. But Polyculture, shade growing is kind of being re-recognized, especially by specialty coffee producers and the scientific community as a way to combat climate change, right? So it's like these really old practices, indigenous people's methods that go back tens of thousands of years are being re-recognized for actually how important a balanced ecosystem is and how important it is to maintain natural ecosystems. And this kind of carries us into the final section, environmental pressures. Um, there's another study I would highly recommend reading. You can find all of the studies in the lesson plan. I will re-drop those links in here. Um, but there was a study about avocado, coffee, and cashew. These three things grow along the coffee belt, right? They grow in this kind of area between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. And in this study, they basically looked at projections of climate change and wanted to basically examine what is the potential basically unsustainability of growing coffee, cashew, and avocado. Like, what land are we currently growing these things on that is in danger of not being able to grow these things anymore? And surprise, coffee is projected to be the most affected by climate change. And that's because Arabica species, the Arabica as a species, is not changing quickly enough at the rate of which the climate is changing. So by 2050, it's estimated that the four big producers, Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, and Indonesia, will decrease by 50% in terms of land that is sustainable to grow coffee on, meaning you can actually make money growing coffee on that land versus the amount you're spending on maintaining that land, right? So by 2050, it's estimated that we'll lose half of the land coffee currently grows on. They expect Ethiopia to mostly stay the same. And then the area where coffee production will is expected to increase. You can see it's way far north and way far south, right? Out of coffee's natural zone of life. So the US, Argentina, Uruguay, China, they're expected to increase in suitability of growing coffee. So I would recommend going and reading the study. They've got a lot of really great maps, and it's fascinating, but it's a great way to kind of like visualize how much land coffee is growing on and what amount of that land is in danger. So basically, they like made suitability grades based on all the things we've talked about, right? Temperature, precipitation, um, nutrients within the soil, slope, fragment sizes, organic compounds, pH, all these kind of things we've talked about. There's suitability class one, which means this is the most suitable for coffee, versus two, versus three, versus not suitable, right? So they put metrics to all those things and they've ran those against RCPs, which are basically scenarios, right? Based on emissions, our projections of emissions into the atmosphere, land concentration, and land use trajectories. And the big takeaway here, you can look, there's world, Brazil, Vietnam, Indonesia, Colombia. They're expecting suitability one class land to decrease by 54% under the least aggressive scenario. Under the most aggressive global warming scenario, 60%. Suitability two land decrease by 30% up to 40. Suitability three land increase by almost 3% to decrease by 13. And then not suitable land increase by 1.3 to 4.1 land. So on a global level, land that is perfectly suitable for coffee is expected to decrease by more than 50% is the big takeaway. And this is because of rising temperatures and inconsistent rains. So this is just a kind of a comparison of different areas where the classes will change. I'll let you go read this study if you want to. But basically, there's rising average temperatures and inconsistent rains. Humans are ultimately causing this, right? Um, and so this effect is being realized on many crops, but it is particularly hurting coffee. All this is causing that zone of life to decrease. Um, we're seeing an increase in pest pathogens and weeds, which contributes to unsuitability. All of this kind of decreasing the sustainability of growing coffee, right? You can see here that when it rains during harvest, the cherries split. So when it's raining, when we're not expecting it to rain, it can decimate a harvest, right? This is just like one example of climatic changes that are really hurting coffee producing areas. When you pair climatic pressures with the challenges of finding labor, an extremely volatile market, inflation of goods needed to live or service the farm, it's easy to understand why many farmers are leaving the industry and future generations are selling generational farms off, right? The amount of young producers is kind of an epidemic. Not many young producers are continuing in coffee. And it's because there are so many challenges, right? When we think about pests and pathogens, um, the environment plays a key role in this. The environment can either favor the plant or the environment favors a pathogen. And so, you know, when an environment has been damaged, or it's not a healthy environment, it's going to favor the pathogen over the coffee, right? So, for example, the coffee leaf rust epidemic within Central and South America in 2011, basically low market prices reduced fertilization, and there were more abandoned farms. All of that causes a reduction in overall plant health throughout a country, for example. And that year, it was really warm, wet weather during what was supposed to be a dry season. That kind of condition favored coffee leaf rust or Hemilia vastatrix. So you have a reduction in plant health, you have weather that favors coffee leaf rust, you have storms moving coffee leaf rust around, then all of these abandoned farms can't resist the infection and it spreads and becomes an epidemic, right? So this is where we kind of get back to again that shade grown systems. Having lots of biodiversity helps fight these things off, but also climate is just changing to a point where it's not favoring coffee as much as it's favoring enemies to coffee, right? Um, so the outbreaks across Central America from 2011 to 2013 estimated financial losses of $500 million within those 2 years. Coffee leaf rust peaked in Guatemala in 2012, and it spread throughout 70% of coffee producing land. And it led to a declaration of a state of emergency, right? Um, Employment in the coffee sector dropped by 30%, lasting till 2017. So, spreading of diseases um, greatly impacts the coffee workforce, right? And so this is just kind of that ripple effect of climates changing, rain becoming unpredictable. I don't want to oversimplify this stuff or say I have an answer, but when we zoom out, a fluctuation in temperature and rain, plus a need for increased profits in a difficult economy, oops, um, leads to maximizing production, right? So you decrease um, the amount of forest, you decrease the amount of organic matter, you decrease the ability to fight pests and pathogens. All of this increases in chemical inputs, which increases in greenhouse gas emissions, which again kind of starts that cycle over of global warming, right? So there's kind of this cycle in terms of all of agriculture that we've seen playing out, not for the best in coffee. The more producers I talked to for this class, they talked about the importance of reforestation, maintaining indigenous species, returning indigenous plants and animals to the area, which increases the soil health, which decreases the need for chemical input, which increases coffee production. And then you have other streams of revenue because of all those indigenous species that can be used for subsistence or other markets, right? And so again, I don't want to oversimplify or say this is the solution, but in talking to specialty focused producers, we see how current research and experimentation kind of leads to combat ecological pressures by cultivating healthier ecosystems. It sounds obvious, but the healthier the ecosystem, the more able it is to fight these kinds of challenges. Granting producers hopefully more income streams, right? So climate change is an increasingly important issue, and coffee is in very much danger. And so this is the path. Um, and ultimately, producers these kinds of things, right? Again, going back to coffee production, it is a science art practice. Coffee production is highly technical. There are an infinite amount of variables that are affecting decisions made. And many of those are uncontrollable. Can't quantify the amount of time and labor that all these tasks we've talked about require to produce the world's best coffee. Um, uh, Sorry, I don't know why it's just skipped back. Um, we can't quantify producers' experience, familiarity, and intuition with their ecosystem. Um, but we can better look at our business practices and understand how we better support this industry and producers within the industry, right? Um, I highly recommend here at the end of class, we've been doing a video series where we just talk with Costa Rican coffee producers. We have a little playlist on our YouTube if you want to listen to producers talk about both the challenges and the triumphs of coffee production. And again, I don't want to oversimplify anything in this class, um, but I want to, basically look at the challenges a producer faces, how much work goes into coffee production so we can understand how much value is behind coffee production. I also want to thank all these people for helping me make this class. Again, many producers and agronomists help me fact check and contribute things to this class, and I really, really appreciate them taking the time. Again, if you want to read any of the studies that we've talked about, you can download the lesson plan and go read these. They're all linked out. Um, there's some really, really interesting stuff out there. And then I want to thank you for joining me today. I know I went all of 2 hours here, but if you have any questions, I'll stick around. Would love to answer your questions. If you want to email me, education@cafeimports. I would love to talk to you more. And then if you want to give any feedback on this class in particular, I would really appreciate your feedback. I'll drop those there.